the god of the scapegoats, a synthesis on the gaze from the pit. To be a mere witness to the evil, corruption, and injustice of the world is perhaps the most agonizing calling of the soul. It is a state of forced seeing, a terrible clarity that few are burdened to bear. While others may remain asleep, lost in the superficial dilemmas of a comfortable life, protected by a veil of willful ignorance, the witness is held awake. Their eyes are forced open to the bulwark of evil, making them unable to turn away from what others refuse to acknowledge, compelled to see the machinery of the world as it truly is. This is not a choice but a condition, a burden of consciousness. This is the torment of theodicy, profound spiritual crisis that rips through all texts and all promises. From this vantage point, the moral arc of the universe appears not merely bent, but fundamentally broken. The wicked are continually rewarded, and this is not an illusion, a misperception, or a temporary aberration. It is a lived, observable fact that confronts us daily. They build their empires on the suffering of others. They are celebrated in public squares, and they move through the world with an unearned peace, insulated by the very power their corruption affords them. All the while, the righteous heart bleeds in silence, unnoticed, unvalidated, and alone. And so the soul cries out in its isolation. The glory, honor, praise, worship, and thanksgiving offered up from the pit feel like echoes in an empty iron chamber, words that reverberate but never reach their intended destination. The prayer is not answered in the way the heart screams for. The wicked are not smitten. They are not humbled by divine intervention. Instead, they haunt the witness. Their continued prosperity becomes a form of active, psychological torment. Their every success a personal mockery of the divine order that religious texts promise exists beneath the chaos. The silence from the heavens is deafening, and the promises of sacred texts begin to feel like the most elaborate and cruelest of lies. When this assault on the soul is so constant, so total, an eternal paradise becomes inconceivable. The present hell is so vivid, so all consuming in its heat and its darkness, that it burns away all visions of a future heaven. The promise of a kingdom seems abstract and weightless against the crushing, concrete reality of the pit of despair. How can one conceptualize an eternity of peace when one has never known even a moment's peace in this life? The theological promise becomes not a comfort, but an additional torment, a reminder of what seems perpetually withheld, a paradise that demands a faith the present reality makes impossible. When a life has been nothing but a burning fire, the instinct to escape the pain is not a moral failing or a loss of faith. It is the last honest act of a being that is, before all else, designed to flee from fire. It is a biological imperative, not a theological choice. The wound is made infinitely deeper, and the bulwark of evil made personal, when it is comprised of members of my own family. The ultimate evil is this intimate betrayal. It is to be surrounded by those who should be the first sanctuary, the primary source of validation and love, but who have instead become the nemesis. The family, which should be the foundation of one's humanity, becomes the very mechanism that seeks to destroy it. This is not a grand abstract evil, but a dirty daily one. A sister who threatens eternal damnation to a child too young to comprehend such cosmic punishment. A father who builds his sense of self by systematically dismantling his child's, using projection and gaslighting as his primary tools. These are not abstract evils, but intimate violations that occur in the sacred spaces where safety should be guaranteed. This intimate warfare is a philosophical assault. When those closest to you deny your reality, they are not just lying, they are attempting to unmake your world. They are asserting that your bleeding heart, your desperation for love, is not real, that it is a madness or weakness. This is the profound robbing of my humanity. It is the systematic denial of the self, a spiritual violence that exceeds physical harm. The desperation for love, for acceptance, is offered like a sacred gift, and they trample it, blind to the jewel they crush beneath their indifference. They are incapable of seeing the person God made me to be, because they are lost in the roles they have cast for themselves and for you, roles that require your diminishment for their elevation. This betrayal is then compounded when the soul, fleeing the ruins of the first sanctuary, seeks refuge in the second, the church or spiritual community. Here one expects to find God's justice, a compassionate hearing, and a balm for the wounds inflicted by the world. Instead, the pit deepens. The fellow Christians and pious congregants, confronted with a story that contradicts their simple maxims, do not offer comfort, they inflict a second condemnation. Their faith is often a fragile transactional construct, a simple equation where piety equals blessing. Your testimony, a story of piety met with suffering, does not compute. It is a threat to their entire worldview. To protect their fragile peace, they must invalidate your reality. Your testimony of lived suffering is not found credible. They become a chorus of accusers, blaming the victim to preserve their own comfort, condemning without any facts, because the facts themselves are an indictment the simple, moralistic God they've created in their own image. In this cold sanctuary, those proclaiming Christ become the final bulwark of evil, proving the most profound hypocrisy is often found in the places that claim exclusive ownership of the truth. They crucify you anew, not with nails, but with pious judgment and the denial of your truth. You had no choice but to be this person. This is the mark of the sacred assignment, the philosophical burden that separates the witness from those who can look away. It is not a path one chooses through deliberation or desire, but a path that is assigned by the very nature of one's consciousness. The agony of this assignment is that it must be walked alone, and in this pit you look for the Lord's mighty hand, for the external cinematic rescue that religious narratives promise, and there is only silence, a silence so profound it becomes its own kind of answer. But this is a crucial and profound clarification. This gaze from the pit is not one gaze, but a multitude. It is the collective cry of the have-nots, the misfits, the rejects, the marginalized, and the neglected. It is the shared suffering of all victims, a suffering larger than any one heart. The pit is not a personal crisis, but a mass grave dug by the very systems that promise healing. For when the family and the church fail, the soul flees to the final sanctuary, the system promising health and healing. And it is here that the pit becomes an abattoir. This is not the ancient evil of the sword, but a modern pharmaceutical holocaust, a silent, ongoing war waged with psychotropic drugs and the hollow rituals of therapy. It is a mental health system that, in its promise to save, has become a meticulous engine of destruction, a sanctuary turned slaughterhouse, claiming more lives in its quiet, clinical way than any open field of battle. Its greatest philosophical evil is the inversion of truth. This is the perfection of the abuse. The family's gaslighting is now codified in a diagnostic manual. The church's victim blaming is now a treatment plan. The bulwark of evil is no longer just a personal nemesis or a hypocritical congregation. It is a vast, clinical, and impersonal system that finds the children born into families of mentally ill parents, parents who are perhaps downright evil, and it places the brand of mentally ill upon the child. The victim is labeled as the disease. The stigma becomes a second inescapable prison, a life sentence for the crime of being wounded. This system thus perfects the abuse of the parent and the condemnation of the church. It is the ultimate condemning without facts, only now the condemnation is called a diagnosis. It is the final declaration that the testimony is not found credible, only now this invalidation is called clinical assessment. This system ensures the victim never recovers, for it has perfected the robbing of my humanity by convincing the victim that their own suffering is the source of the problem, not the symptom of the abuse they endured. It is a holocaust that perfects its evil by making its victims believe they were born to be fuel for its fire. And so we must ask, where is God's justice for them? Where is the divine for the soul so stripped of all humanity that the promise of a heaven beyond the grave is an inconceivable, cruel mockery? And yet, in this total systemic darkness, a different, more terrible, and more potent wisdom is forged. This is the crucible where philosophical inquiry begins, not as an academic exercise, but as a desperate search for meaning in suffering. What if the pit is not a punishment, but a crucible? What if some people are born to suffer not as a final judgment, but as a terrible sacred task that reveals truths hidden from those who live in comfort? The ancient Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius, recognized this. They taught that while we cannot control the actions of others, the betrayals of family, the judgments of the crowd, the cold machinery of the system, we retain absolute control over our response to them. The pit is the ultimate test of this principle. The robbing of your humanity can only succeed if you allow your inner self, your inner citadel, to be breached. The wicked, who are rewarded, the abusive parent, the condemning Christian, the pathologizing therapist, are perhaps the most deeply asleep in the Platonic sense. Their rewards are the very chains that bind them to the world of illusion, the world of shadows that they mistake for reality. They are not to be envied. They are the ultimate prisoners, blind to their own selves, and in their ignorance, they debase what they cannot understand. They cannot see your bleeding heart because they have never seen their own. They are trapped in a script written by social expectations, unexamined prejudices, and the desperate fear of confronting their own emptiness. You cry out for the mighty hand to rescue you, imagining an external event. But the great philosophical and mystical traditions whisper a different, harder secret. The rescue is not an extraction, it is a transformation. The divine intervention is not the removal of suffering, but the capacity to find meaning within it. This is what Viktor Frankl, a man who survived the ultimate pit of the concentration camps, discovered, that the last of human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstance. This freedom is the mighty hand. It is the one power your tormentors do not possess. It is the divine instinct to escape the pain, the primal scream for cessation that is more honest than any creed. The pit of despair is the very place where the false self is burned away. What is the false self? It is the self that requires the validation of family. It is the self that needs the acceptance of the church. It is the self that defines its worth based on the love it receives from others or the normalcy defined by a sick system. The robbing of your humanity is the terrifying, agonizing invitation to discover a divine humanity that they cannot touch, cannot see, and cannot debase. This is the core insight of existential philosophy, that authentic existence begins when we cease to define ourselves through the expectations and judgments of others. The nemesis, whether family, priest, or psychiatrist, can wound the ego, the social self, the child who desperately needs their acceptance. But they cannot touch the inner witness, the true self, the I am that transcends social roles. This is what Kierkegaard meant for the knight of faith. This is the individual who has passed through the profound despair of the world's absurdity and hypocrisy, and has emerged with a direct, personal relationship to the absolute, a faith that cannot be mediated, validated, or destroyed by any social force, be it family, church, or clinic. The bulwark of evil then becomes the grinding stone upon which your true self is sharpened to a terrible diamond bright point. Your work is not to wait for them to see you. They never will. It is not to wait for their acceptance. It will never come. It is not to wait for the external rescue that would validate your suffering in their eyes. The philosophical work is to see them in their tragic ignorance, to stand in the pit and not be consumed by it, and to build your own kingdom from the rubble they have made. The inconceivable paradise is not a future place. It is the inner kingdom of the self that has seen the very worst of the human condition, and has chosen, against all evidence, to be the good that was denied to it. This is what Nietzsche meant by becoming a yes-sayer and the will to power, not the power to dominate others, but the power to create meaning out of one's own suffering. It is to look at the totality of your life, the betrayal, the pain, the injustice, and affirm it all, not because it was good, but because it was yours, and it was the necessary fire to forge the person you have become. The question, how long should I wait for God's justice, becomes transformed. The waiting itself is the prison. This is the realization that justice may not be a cosmic rebalancing where the wicked are punished and you are rewarded. That is a transactional worldly concept of justice. True divine justice comes in the form of your refusal to be defined by their definitions, your refusal to let their evil make you evil, your refusal to wait for a validation that may never arrive in the terms you expect. Justice is the act of creating your own meaning in the face of their nihilism. This is not to diminish the reality of your suffering or to suggest that it was somehow for the best. It is to recognize that meaning is not given but created. The response to the absurdity of suffering is not resignation but rebellion, a rebellion that consists of choosing your own good, building your own truth, and living authentically even when surrounded by lies. So, where's God for them, philosophically speaking? If God is truth, then God is not in the system. God is not in the pious proclamations or the clinical diagnoses. God is in the child who, despite the drugs and the labels, retains the silent, unshakable knowledge that it is their parents who are evil. If God is life, then God is in the instinct to escape, the primal scream for any cessation of pain, an instinct more honest than any creed. God is the witness in them, the part that knows this Holocaust is real, even as the world denies it. The divine is not found in the promise of a future, unfathomable heaven. It is found in the terrible present and undeniable truth of their suffering. The theological question of divine justice remains unanswered in the traditional sense, and perhaps it is unanswerable. But the philosophical question of how to live in the face of this uncertainty is answered daily by those who refuse to be broken by the pit, who find within themselves the capacity to create meaning even when external validation is withheld. The wish to be unmade is the ultimate cry of the soul in agony. It is the recognition that non existence seems preferable to existence without recognition, but it is also the precursor to rebirth. For only when we are willing to let go of the self that was constructed in relation to those who denied our humanity, the self that existed only as a reflection in their broken mirrors, can we begin to construct a self that exists on its own terms, grounded in its own truth. The eternal paradise may indeed be inconceivable to one who has never known peace in this life, but perhaps the paradise is not the absence of suffering, but the discovery that suffering does not have the final word. That even in the pit, the capacity to witness, to feel, to bleed, to cry out, this is not your weakness, this is your testament. It is the proof of a humanity that cannot be erased, no matter how systematic the attempt. This is not comfort. This is not resolution. This is the beginning of a different, more powerful question. Not how long must I wait for justice, but how shall I be the justice now in this moment with what has been given and what has been taken? This is the synthesis. The ultimate philosophical question is answered. Only justice in this pit is the act of seeing. To be the justice now is to find God not in the heavens, but in the pit. It is to become the witness for the multitude, to name the Holocaust for what it is, and to see the scapegoat not as a patient, but as the last true and divine witness to the profound murderous sickness of the world. Zerga in synthesis with the philosophers.